There are moments in history when defeat doesn't come with a lost battle, but arrives in silence. When orders are still given, but no one believes they carry meaning anymore. When an army once thought to be invincible begins to collapse, not from a lack of weapons, but because faith has died from within. If you want to understand the moment when people realize a war is lost before it actually ends, stay with History War. And if you value historical stories told slowly, deeply, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can look back at history not just through victories, but through the real cost they carried. There are moments in war when no cannon fire is needed to signal defeat. No white flags, no lines of soldiers laying down arms, no urgent bulletins broadcast over the airwaves, only a creeping, slow, yet unstoppable feeling that things have gone too far to be saved, that what lies ahead is nothing more than the inertia of a machine that's lost its direction. For many German officers and soldiers, that moment didn't come in April 1945, when Berlin was surrounded and artillery shook every street. It came much earlier, in the final months of 1944, when orders still came regularly, when seals were still neatly stamped on papers, but no one truly believed those orders would lead to victory. In damp command bunkers under dim yellow lights, maps were still spread out just like in the early years of the war. Arrows, symbols, and counterattack plans still filled every corner. But something had changed, something no report ever recorded: the eyes of those standing around the table. They no longer looked at the maps with the eagerness of people about to win, but with the emptiness of men calculating how much time was left. Not to win, but to hold on. Not to change the outcome, but to delay the inevitable. Soldiers on the front lines sensed the shift before anyone else. When supplies started arriving later than usual, when promises of reinforcements became familiar phrases that never came true, when artillery had to ration every shell, and tanks were abandoned by the roadside not because they were hit, but because there was no fuel to move them. In letters sent home, if there was still enough time and paper, the tone had changed. No longer the pride of someone representing a rising empire, but the weariness of people who knew they were being swept along by a current they no longer controlled. The most terrifying thing wasn't the enemy drawing closer, it was the collapse of meaning. When a soldier goes to battle, no longer believing that his death serves any purpose, then the war has already been lost from within. And that was the silent tragedy of the German army in its final phase. They kept fighting not because they believed in victory, but because there was no other choice. Orders were still orders. Refusal meant immediate execution. Obedience, at the very least, held the faint hope that maybe tomorrow would be different. But even in that despair, memory wandered back to a much earlier time. A time when everything seemed simple, clear, and full of belief. When war hadn't yet become a years-long psychological burden, but was still a chain of stunning victories that shocked the world. To understand the moment they realized the war was lost, we have to return to the moment that stood in stark contrast to it, when it seemed impossible to lose. There's a bitter irony in history. It was those early victories that planted the seeds of later collapse. When everything happened too quickly, too smoothly, people began to believe they had unlocked the formula of history. That war could be solved like a technical problem, that with enough speed, discipline, and decisiveness, any enemy could be crushed. That belief wasn't born from failure, but from glory. And once it took root in the minds of commanders, it became more dangerous than any enemy on the battlefield. The officers who stood silently in the command bunkers of 1944, knowing the war was lost, were the same men who had witnessed or been told of those early euphoric days. They remembered all too well a time when none of them could even imagine collapse, when the army advanced with unprecedented speed, when European capitals fell one after another, when the feeling of invincibility wasn't just propaganda, but seemed proven by reality. It's from those memories that the later spiritual collapse became even more painful. Because in order to lose faith, you must have once believed completely. And the German army had believed in itself, in its command system, in its military doctrine, and in the idea that history had chosen them as its instrument. The moment they realized the war was lost was not some sudden awakening, but the final stop on a long road that began with their loudest victories. To understand how a war machine once seen as flawless could destroy itself from the inside, we can't just look at the desperate final months. We have to return to where it all began, to where belief was born, nurtured, and slowly transformed into illusion. Because it was in those years, 1939 to 1940, when the war began with blinding speed and seemingly unstoppable outcomes, that the seeds of collapse were quietly sown, disguised as the fruits of total victory. In September 1939, when the first shots rang out at dawn, war did not descend upon Europe like a chaotic storm, but like a machine perfectly oiled and ready to run. Everything unfolded so swiftly that even those operating the machinery were swept up in its own accelerating rhythm. Orders were issued with precision, units advanced on schedule, and victory reports rolled in like cold clinical statistics. In less than 3 weeks, Poland collapsed, not because its army didn't fight, but because it was crushed by speed, a new kind of weapon, intangible, but more ruthless than artillery. In the German headquarters, war maps were no longer sites of debate, but stages of confirmation. Red pins pierced deeper into enemy territory so rapidly that map officers had to rotate in shifts just to keep up. No one asked whether the campaign could fail. The only question was, how much faster can we move? War, in that mindset, lost its inherent uncertainty. It became a process, a sequence of precise steps where people simply played their roles and victory would inevitably appear at the end of the path. That belief wasn't born from mere propaganda, it was reinforced by reality. When the German army swept into Norway and Denmark, then turned westward, all cautious predictions were shattered by fact. France, a military power seen as a pillar of European order, fell within weeks. A line of defense once deemed impenetrable wasn't overcome by reckless force, but by a cold, ruthless calculation. When Paris fell, it wasn't just a nation that was defeated. An entire idea of classical warfare crumbled with it. For many German officers, this was the moment they believed they were witnessing history being rewritten. No longer the drawn-out attrition wars of World War I, no more muddy stalemates and endless trenches. This was warfare for a new century. Fast, precise, and seemingly unstoppable. In that atmosphere, doubt became redundant. Anyone who questioned the momentum was seen as outdated, or worse, as someone lacking faith in a system proving its success daily. The feeling of invincibility flowed from the upper echelons of command down to the common soldier. For many young troops, war at first wasn't a tragedy. It was a kind of affirmation. They marched through foreign lands with the mindset of victors. They believed they were part of something greater, something history had chosen to favor. Early hardships, sleepless nights, hunger, exhaustion were viewed as small prices to pay for the glory ahead. When victories came swiftly and decisively, every sacrifice felt justified. It was here that a dangerous line began to blur. When success repeats often enough, it ceases to be seen as the result of favorable conditions, enemy mistakes, or timely decisions. It begins to feel like a natural state, as if the world had been reordered to align with the will of the victors. And when victory becomes a given, failure becomes a foreign concept, something unimaginable. In 1939 to 1940, the German army didn't just win on the battlefield, they won in their own perception. The command structure was reinforced by the belief that they had discovered the correct formula. Military doctrines were elevated to the level of absolute truth. Early successes were held up as proof that nothing needed to change, only to go faster, act more decisively, take bigger risks. In that atmosphere, caution was no longer a virtue. It was seen as a dangerous hesitation. This is when war began to slip away from its flexible nature. Instead of being the art of adapting to the unpredictable, it was gradually boxed into a rigid framework. Success was no longer analyzed for its causes. It was cited as proof of the system's inherent rightness. Questions like, what if the conditions change, were rarely asked. Because in a world of back-to-back victories, the conditions never seem to change for the worse. But history does not move in a straight line. And it was in that very moment of supreme confidence that the seeds of disaster were sown. When a machine grows used to always being right, it forgets how to respond when reality no longer follows the plan. When people believe they are invincible, they stop listening for the smallest warning signs. And when those signals are ignored for too long, when they finally become undeniable truths, it is already too late to course correct. The early blitzkrieg victories didn't just defeat the enemy, they defeated the German army's capacity for self-doubt. A system that no longer questions itself is a system preparing for its greatest mistake. Because war, no matter how modern, is still a realm where absolute certainty is always a dangerous illusion. And over time, those early triumphs began to distort. They were no longer outcomes to be evaluated, but standards to which all future decisions had to conform. From here, a silent yet deadly transformation began. Victory was no longer something to be earned through adaptable thinking. It became a moral and ideological benchmark. Success, instead of opening the door to debate, shut it completely. And at that point, it was not the enemy outside, but the army's own unwavering faith in its early victories that would carry it into the next phase. A phase where success was no longer a lesson, but a dogma. After those early victories, war was no longer seen as a series of decisions to be carefully weighed day by day. It gradually came to feel like an inevitable current. Everything seemed to have been proven by reality, and that very certainty shifted military thinking in the most dangerous way. When success repeats often enough, it ceases to be a result worth dissecting. It becomes evidence of an absolute truth. In that atmosphere, war no longer belonged to the realm of doubt and adaptation, but turned into a closed belief system where every question already had a predetermined answer. In Berlin, reports of victory traveled up an increasingly narrow path. Information was no longer passed along to reflect reality, but to reinforce the beliefs already held by those at the top. Whatever aligned with expectations was emphasized. Unfavorable details, logistical struggles, signs of strain within the machine, these were blurred or filtered out. Not because someone was actively sabotaging, but because the entire system had internalized a dangerous lesson. Saying the uncomfortable truth brought no reward, while affirming the collective faith was celebrated. In that context, Hitler was no longer just the man setting political direction. He increasingly became the center of all military decisions. The victories of 1939 to 1940 were directly associated with his name, and this created a subtle but profound inversion within the command structure. Generals, who had been trained in a military tradition that valued bait and critical thinking, began to shift their behavior. They no longer argued to find the best solution, but to guess what their superior wanted to hear. Strategy was no longer formed through the clash of different perspectives, but through the convergence of like-minded affirmations. When success is deified, it demands absolute obedience. Each past victory becomes a precedent that future decisions must follow. If a method worked once, it was assumed to work forever. The space for flexibility slowly suffocated under the weight of mistaken lessons drawn from success. People stopped asking, is this suitable for the new conditions, and instead asked, how can we repeat what already worked? Within the German military, this shift happened quietly, but deeply. Mid-level officers, those most in touch with the reality on the ground, began to sense that something was wrong. But that understanding rarely pierced the invisible wall of collective belief. When all major decisions were wrapped in the narrative of invincibility, raising doubt felt like sabotaging the spirit of victory. And in a regime where loyalty was placed above critical thinking, silence became the safest option. It was in this phase that war began to lose its capacity for self-correction. A system that only learns from victory will never be prepared for failure. And when failure does arrive, it is not recognized as a signal to change, but dismissed as an inconvenient exception to be hidden or explained away. Minor setbacks and localized breakdowns, instead of serving as early warnings, were crushed beneath the weight of louder victory narratives. Success became dogma not only because it was glorified, but because it was defended. Doubt was treated as a threat to an order that had already been proven right. In that atmosphere, war was no longer a life or death series of decisions within countless shifting variables. It was reduced to a formula: keep advancing, strike hard, impose your will, and the enemy will collapse. A simple, seductive, and dangerous logic. The danger lies in this: dogma does not accept reality. It only accepts what confirms itself. When reality begins to shift, dogma does not adapt. It demands that reality bend to fit. And when it can't be bent, the cost is passed down to those on the front lines. Soldiers and frontline officers became the ones to bear the consequences of decisions made in a theoretical world that no longer matched the battlefield. By late 1940 and early 1941, as the war in the West temporarily settled, the German command faced a pivotal question. But instead of approaching it with caution, they saw it through the lens of their already formed dogma. If Blitzkrieg had defeated Poland and France, then the same logic must apply anywhere. Not because the conditions were identical, but because they believed their method had transcended all conditions. With that belief, warnings were downplayed. The vast distances, complex logistics, brutal weather, and the enemy's capacity to mobilize, these were all reduced to secondary variables. Because dogma does not exist to assess risk, it exists to reaffirm what is already believed. And once dogma takes over strategic thinking, the next major decision is no longer the product of multidimensional analysis. It's the extreme extension of a logic that refuses to bend. At that moment, many within the command no longer asked whether a new war was necessary. The question had already been replaced by the assumption that it would succeed. When success becomes a given, a new war is no longer seen as a gamble, but as the inevitable next step in a predetermined sequence of triumphs. And within that false sense of certainty, a turning point decision was made. Summer 1941 was approaching. On the maps, arrows began to stretch again, longer, deeper, and more ambitious than ever before. No longer confined to the familiar terrain of Western Europe, they pointed toward a vast space where distance and time would become silent enemies. But to those who believed in the dogma of victory, this was just a larger France. One more campaign to reaffirm what had already been proven. And so, from absolute faith in their own success, the German military stepped into its boldest decision yet, not with the caution of those aware of their limits, but with the confidence of a system convinced it had transcended all limits. From that point on, the myth of invincibility would face its greatest test when war no longer followed its familiar pace, and the coming summer would expose the fragility of a belief once thought unshakable. In the early hours of summer 1941, as convoys and infantry formations began crossing the eastern border, the mood within the German army bore little resemblance to a reckless gamble. It felt more like a ritual, one that had been rehearsed to perfection. Orders were issued with familiar confidence, plans were presented in the language of certainty. To many, this wasn't a risky turning point, but a logical extension of a proven formula. In strategic briefings, the Soviet Union was reduced to a vast yet backward space, an opponent that could be brought to its knees if struck quickly and hard enough. Summer, with its long daylight hours and dry roads, was seen as a natural ally of Blitzkrieg. The first days seemed to confirm everything they believed. German spearheads surged forward at staggering speed. Soviet armies were encircled in massive pincer movements, hundreds of thousands of prisoners corralled into open fields. On the maps, the arrows extended like cold, sharp blades cutting deep into enemy territory. Victory reports flooded headquarters, filled with the same numbers and language that had become familiar over the past campaigns. In that moment, there seemed to be no room for doubt. The myth of invincibility wasn't just unchallenged, it was reinforced on an unprecedented scale. But war is not measured solely by territory gained. It is measured by the ability to sustain momentum. And here, the first cracks began to show. As German units pushed deeper, the gap between front and rear lines stretched to the point of near chaos. The roads were no longer the paved, familiar routes of Europe, but dusty, eroded trails where wheels wore down faster than expected and every supply run faced delays that hadn't been factored in. But in the euphoria of early success, these warning signs were brushed aside as temporary glitches, problems that could be solved with more willpower and speed. Faith in Blitzkrieg created a dangerous blindness to reality. There was a belief that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, that just a few more hard blows would bring everything to an end. As a result, signs that the campaign was consuming resources faster than anticipated were ignored. When fuel began to run low in the deepest spearheads, the response wasn't to slow down. It was to push faster, to seize supplies ahead. When replacement parts couldn't keep pace with wear and tear, vehicles were simply abandoned rather than the plan adjusted. Everything revolved around a single assumption: the war would end before these problems became critical. The Soviet Union, contrary to simplified predictions, did not collapse. Each successful encirclement only opened up more territory ahead, vast, punishing space where German troops had to press on under increasingly harsh conditions. Distance was no longer just a number on a map, it was time, fuel, human exhaustion. And while the German machine was built for rapid strikes, the enemy began to show a capacity to absorb blows in a way that stretched every plan beyond its intended limits. At the front lines, soldiers began to feel the difference between previous victories and this new kind of war. They still advanced, still took towns, still drove the enemy back, but the certainty had changed tone. The quick naps on roadsides, the endless days of marching with no visible endpoint, gradually wore down morale. When battles were no longer decisive events, but just another link in an endless chain, war revealed its true nature, an unforgiving process of attrition. In the upper echelons of command, the dogma of victory continued to shape perception. Every hardship was interpreted as a sign that the enemy was resisting in desperation. Every delay was explained away by asserting that ultimate victory was still inevitable. Instead of questioning the original assumptions, the leadership adjusted reality to fit the belief, and in doing so, the war gradually slid out of their control. Summer did not pass as swiftly as expected. Major objectives remained out of reach, and time began to emerge as a silent enemy. As units neared critical cities, the enemy's resistance did not diminish as anticipated. Every kilometer forward demanded more effort, more lives, more resources. The war machine, designed to conclude operations with swift, decisive blows, was now grinding forward under prolonged strain, something it had never encountered before. And it was in that strain that the myth of invincibility began to crack. Not from a single devastating defeat, but from the accumulation of smaller problems. Tanks stalled for lack of fuel. Artillery couldn't be deployed on time because the roads wouldn't allow it. Exhausted soldiers kept advancing simply because there was no other choice. Every small decision made to keep the campaign moving only added more pressure to the whole system. By the end of summer, a question began to creep into the minds of those on the ground, though few dared say it aloud. What happens if the war doesn't end this summer? It was a question the doctrine of victory had no answer for. The entire strategy had been built on the premise that it would never have to be asked, and the absence of that answer made every plan fragile as time continued slipping away. Summer had revealed the limits of belief. It didn't destroy the machine outright, but it forced it to operate beyond its original design. As long, sunny days gave way to colder mornings, the war entered a phase no plan had truly accounted for. The challenges of distance, logistics, and manpower didn't disappear with the changing season. They simply took on new forms, harsher ones, no longer hidden by speed. And when the first cold winds swept across the eastern fields, signaling the approach of winter, the German war machine began facing something it had never seriously considered as part of its strategy. The myth of invincibility wasn't shattered by a single blow, but by a prolonged collision with reality. From here on, the war would no longer be a story of speed and summer light. It would become a brutal confrontation with winter, a force absent from every original plan. Winter didn't arrive as a sudden event. It came day by day, night by night, breath by breath, bitterly cold, yet as something no one was truly ready to acknowledge. In the original plans, winter existed only as an abstract point in time, a distant marker the war was supposed to have ended long before reaching. And so, when summer passed without a decisive victory, the German army didn't enter winter as a force prepared, but as one trapped. The early autumn rains turned roads into mud, slowing already strained supply convoys to a crawl. But that was only the prelude. As temperatures began to drop below familiar levels, what had seemed like technical problems transformed into threats to survival. Lubricants thickened in engines, metal shrank, machines once seen as symbols of industrial might began to betray their users over the smallest mechanical details. Tanks failed to start in the morning, not because they'd been hit, but because of the cold. Artillery couldn't fire on time, not due to lack of shells, but because their mechanisms had frozen. The frontline soldier didn't feel winter by the calendar, but in his own body. Thin coats, boots that couldn't retain warmth, gloves in short supply. The cold didn't just numb fingers and toes, it silently eroded morale. When every simple movement caused pain, the will to fight didn't collapse all at once, but was worn down hour by hour. Deaths from frostbite began to appear among the casualties, grim reminders that the enemy wasn't only ahead, but also in the air around them. In the command bunkers, silence grew heavier than any artillery barrage. Reports took on a different tone. No longer filled with confident numbers of territory gained, they were full of requests: more warm clothing, more fuel, more time. But time was the one thing that could not be supplied, because to ask for it was to admit that the original plan had failed. And in a system where absolute belief had hardened into dogma, admitting error had become almost unthinkable. Instead of adjusting strategy, orders became more rigid. Advance, hold the line, no retreat. The language of command grew more inflexible, as if discipline could replace logistics and willpower could substitute for winter coats. Every meter of ground held became a symbol of loyalty, not of military value, and it was here that war began to shift, from a strategic confrontation to a meaningless test of endurance. Winter exposed a truth that summer had hidden. The German war machine wasn't built for a prolonged campaign under extreme conditions. It was powerful when operating at full pace in familiar environments, but when forced to survive outside its original assumptions, it turned fragile. Units stretched thin across vast front lines had to fend for themselves just to stay alive. Supply lines couldn't be shortened by mere command. Meanwhile, the enemy began to adapt, exploiting the exhaustion of the invader. To the soldier, winter wasn't just cold, it was the feeling of abandonment. When resupply didn't arrive, when wounded comrades weren't evacuated in time, when promises from the rear became empty words, faith began to crack. Not faith in victory, but in the meaning of their suffering. Fighting in summer could be justified by hopes of a quick end, but enduring winter without a clear goal made the question why impossible to ignore. At higher levels, winter created a psychological tension no doctrine could solve. When war refused to follow the plan, the instinct was to cling to some new symbol. Instead of acknowledging the limits just revealed, command began searching for a target big enough to restore belief. A place where victory, if achieved, could wipe away doubt. A name strong enough to drown out the growing collapse of morale. Winter, in that way, didn't just paralyze bodies. It pushed strategic thinking into dangerous territory. When reality no longer fit the dogma, leaders didn't abandon the dogma. They tried to impose it more forcefully on a single decisive point. The idea of a symbolic victory began to take shape, not to solve logistical problems, not to shorten the front, but to reclaim the illusion of control. As the cold tightened its grip, patience thinned, and both political and psychological pressure bore down on every decision. War, once a matter of calculated moves, was now driven by the desperate need to prove something, that the original faith hadn't been wrong, that all the suffering meant something. And to prove that, they needed one undeniable victory, one symbolic enough to eclipse the winter, to cover up the shortages, and to bury the truth that was becoming harder to ignore. It was in that cold, in that deadlock, that the path toward a fateful decision opened, not as the result of clear-eyed analysis, but as a psychological reaction to a reality slipping out of control. When winter forced the German army to stop and confront its own limits, they didn't accept those limits. They turned their gaze elsewhere, toward a city that would soon become a symbol. A place where the logic of war would be sacrificed for meaning and honor. And from there, the war entered a new chapter, where terrain, weather, and human lives would all be consumed by a single name: Stalingrad. Stalingrad did not appear on the war map as an inevitable target of military logic. It appeared as a name. And in war, sometimes a name alone is enough to strangle reason. That city by the Volga was not merely a transportation hub or an industrial center. It carried the heavy symbolism of willpower, of honor, of personal defiance. When the war had already veered off course, when winter had exposed the limits of the war machine, Stalingrad was chosen not because it was the most necessary, but because it meant the most to those who could no longer accept the idea of retreat. From that moment on, the war began to follow a different logic. No longer what must we take to win, but where can we not afford to lose? Stalingrad became the point where everything converged. The honor of the high command, the prestige of the leadership, and the illusion that a single symbolic victory could erase all previous mistakes. In that atmosphere, strategic reasoning gave way to obsession. When German units entered the city, they did not step onto a battlefield in the traditional sense. They stepped into a maze of rubble where every advantage in mobility and firepower was shattered, meter by meter. Factories, basements, stairwells, every wall became a front line. Blitzkrieg, built on speed and open space, was ground into dust in brutal close-quarters fighting, where each room had to be taken with blood. But instead of asking whether this was a battle worth continuing, the orders remained unchanged. Take the city at all costs. At the front, no one understood this better than the soldiers. Stalingrad was unlike any place they'd ever fought. There were no clear front lines, no safe rear areas, no rhythm to catch a breath. By day, the city was pounded by artillery and bombs. By night, shadowy figures emerged from the ruins, turning every hour of rest into a gamble for survival. But even as exhaustion and casualties mounted, the symbolic weight of Stalingrad only grew in the eyes of the high command, and that made every loss acceptable. When the encirclement began to form, reality rang its clearest warning bell. A massive force had been trapped deep inside the city with extended and fragile supply lines. Experienced officers knew that an early withdrawal could save the army and preserve its combat effectiveness elsewhere. But retreat at Stalingrad was no longer a military decision. It had become a political and psychological impossibility, because if Stalingrad fell, the entire myth of invincibility would fall with it. The decision to supply the city by air was born in that context. On paper, it was a technical solution. In practice, it was a flat denial of physical reality. There were not enough planes, the weather would not cooperate, and the needs of hundreds of thousands of men far exceeded anything that could realistically be delivered. But the effort continued, because it allowed the illusion of control to linger. Every plane that made it through became proof that holding Stalingrad had been the right decision, no matter the rising toll in lives and shortages. To the soldiers trapped inside, Stalingrad was no longer a symbol. It was hunger, cold, sickness, and slow death. As ammunition ran out, as rations were cut to the point of starvation, fighting became less a purposeful act and more a final reflex. Yet the orders still came. Hold the line, fight to the last man. In that moment, the absolute obedience once seen as the German army's greatest strength became a collective sentence. Stalingrad was where war crossed the boundary of strategy and entered the realm of obsession. With every passing day that retreat was denied, the psychological cost of retreat grew larger in the minds of decision makers, and so they continued to choose not to retreat. Not because the chances of victory were improving, but because admitting defeat had become psychologically unbearable. At that point, the war was no longer about achieving objectives, but about delaying the moment they would have to face the truth. When collapse finally came, it did not look like a single decisive battle, but like total exhaustion. The encircled army did not fall in an hour, but unraveled over weeks of hunger, freezing cold, and despair. To the outside world, Stalingrad marked a turning point, but to the German high command, it was something deeper, the shattering of a belief system once thought unbreakable. And yet, even after Stalingrad, the dogma did not fully die. The defeat was too vast to be absorbed all at once. Rather than leading to a full reckoning, it triggered a different response. The need to prove that Stalingrad was an exception, that the war machine could still turn the tide if given one more chance. And like any system that has invested too deeply in a single belief, they didn't abandon it. They doubled down. From the ashes of Stalingrad, a new idea for a decisive blow began to take shape. No longer blitzkrieg across vast theaters, but a focused strike, where technology and firepower would be concentrated to reassert dominance. The tank, once the symbol of their early triumphs, was again placed at the heart of their hopes. If Stalingrad had killed logic with symbolism, the new faith would be placed in material strength, in steel, in engines, in the power to break through. And so, even after that devastating loss, the German army did not return to caution. Instead, it stepped into another gamble, not to fix the fundamental errors, but to prove it could still attack. On the wide plains of the East, a new battle was prepared, where the last hopes of the armored empire would be hurled into one final blow. And from there, the story moved into its next chapter, where the name Kursk would replace Stalingrad and where the truth could no longer be hidden behind symbols or will. After Stalingrad, faith didn't disappear, it simply changed shape. Instead of believing in symbols or sheer will, the German war machine shifted its last remaining hope to something more familiar, more tangible: steel, engines, and firepower. If there was anywhere that could prove Stalingrad was just a historical accident, it had to be a battle where every technical advantage could be clearly displayed. Kursk was born in that mindset, not as a flexible choice, but as a blow that had to succeed. On paper, the plan seemed tight: a concentrated offensive, deploying the largest armored force ever assembled, aimed at cutting off a Soviet defensive bulge. Open terrain, favorable conditions, and the debut of new tanks were expected to tip the balance. In meetings, Kursk was spoken of as the moment war would return to its old rhythm: fast, decisive, and final. But beneath that confidence lay a harder truth. This was no longer an attack from a position of strength, but a desperate attempt to regain lost control. The soldiers and officers at the front felt that difference clearly. They didn't enter the campaign with a sense of certainty, but with the heavy awareness that if this failed, there would be no second chance. Every tank sent to the front was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of final hope. And that made the pressure immense. When a battle carries too much meaning, there is no room left for error. Once the attack began, reality quickly proved that the days of easy breakthroughs were over. The enemy wasn't surprised, they were waiting. Minefields, trenches, and defensive firepower were layered in depths never seen before. Every meter forward came at the cost of time and lives. The new tanks, powerful on paper, revealed their flaws under real conditions: mechanical failures, high fuel consumption, and limited field repair capability. Kursk wasn't the place where technology failed instantly. It was where technology was no longer enough to compensate for flawed strategy. Forced to operate continuously within a dense defense network, even the best machines wore down hour by hour. Every tank knocked out didn't just reduce firepower, it chipped away at the belief that engineering alone could still turn the tide. And unlike the early years, there was no space to rebuild strength or regain momentum. At the command level, the response to these difficulties was no longer adaptive. Gone were the creative adjustments and timely shifts. Everything was tied to one goal: break through, push forward, prove that the armored empire still lived. But when advancement brought diminishing returns, the war began to reveal its irreversible nature. Every decision to continue the assault only increased the cost without opening any new path to victory. As the offensive ground to a halt, a cold truth emerged. This was the last time the German army would be able to launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the balance of power not only shifted, it solidified. From here on out, the German military would act in response, not command. They no longer chose the timing, no longer chose the terrain, no longer controlled the conditions. The war, once something they directed, had become something that directed them. To the soldier, Kursk left a deeper emptiness than even Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a catastrophe, but Kursk was confirmation. Confirmation that there were no miracles left. That even with everything, the best equipment, the last reserves, what awaited was only stalemate and loss. Faith, already deeply wounded, now had nothing left to hold on to. In that atmosphere, a spiritual fracture began to emerge. Some continued to cling to orders, seeing obedience as the only path left. But deeper within the military structure, another thought began to form. Quiet, dangerous, and desperate. If war could no longer be won with weapons, if every military effort only prolonged collapse, then the problem no longer lay on the front. It lay at the center of power. After Kursk, many officers understood the war had passed the point of recovery, not because of a single loss, but through the accumulation of strategic failure. But in a system where blame always fell on the lower ranks, speaking the truth meant professional suicide, or literal suicide. So the thought didn't appear in reports. It surfaced in whispered conversations, in brief exchanged glances, and in the heavy sense that absolute loyalty was now driving the country toward destruction. Kursk marked the end of military hope, and as that hope died, an ethical question began to rise. If obeying orders meant prolonging the meaningless death of millions, where was the boundary of duty? For the first time since the war began, some officers stopped thinking about how to win and started thinking about how to end it. This shift didn't erupt loudly. It happened in silence, under the pressure of undeniable failure. As the last tanks were ground down on the eastern plains, faith in material strength evaporated. What remained was not strategy, but conscience. And from the ashes of that final punch, a dangerous but inevitable idea began to form. If the war could no longer be ended on the battlefield, then it would have to be ended by another kind of action, one not aimed at the enemy, but at the very heart of the disaster itself. After Kursk, war was no longer discussed as a military problem. For many German officers, it had become a moral one, not because they had suddenly awakened to abstract notions of right and wrong, but because reality had become too clear to keep lying to themselves. Every road to victory had been sealed. Every order that followed could only prolong destruction, not reverse it. And in that moment, a dangerous question emerged, one that no one had dared to ask seriously before. If the war is already lost, is continued obedience still a duty, or has it become complicity? The July 20th plot was not born of a lust for power. It was born of despair. Those who took part weren't dreamers of final victory, but the people who knew more than anyone that all victories were behind them. They were officers who had led armies, who had believed in doctrine, who had placed their hopes in technology, who had tried and failed to adapt. When every military option had been exhausted, they returned to the final question an army can ask itself: who is responsible for this catastrophe? The decision to target Hitler was not an impulsive act. It was the result of a long accumulation of realization. For months, even years, these men had witnessed the war being driven by personal obsession, by dogma detached from reality. They had seen irrational orders issued, forces sacrificed for abstract honor, and opportunities for withdrawal denied, simply because they didn't fit the myth of invincibility. To them, Hitler was no longer a leader making mistakes. He had become the greatest obstacle to any chance of ending the war. The tragedy of the plot was this: its organizers understood clearly the likelihood of failure. They did not act with the confidence of those expecting success, but with the mindset of people who saw no other option. If they succeeded, the war might end sooner. Millions of lives might be saved. If they failed, their deaths were certain, but even that failure, in the minds of many, was more meaningful than continuing to live as officers executing orders that were leading the nation to total ruin. On July 20th, when the bomb exploded but Hitler survived, that moment didn't just kill the conspirators, it killed one last possibility: the chance that the war could be ended from within by a moral act. That failure echoed louder than any detonation because it was instantly reframed by the regime as proof of treason. From that point on, every form of doubt, every trace of inner dissent was hunted down without mercy. In the days following the plot, the atmosphere within the army changed completely. There was no longer room for safe silence, no more gray areas for differing thoughts. Every officer, every unit was placed under the spotlight of suspicion. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it had to be constantly demonstrated. And the only way to prove it was through absolute, unquestioning obedience. For many soldiers and officers, the failure of July 20th marked the moment they understood the war would not end with reason. Not through negotiation, not through a change in strategy, but only through complete collapse. When the last chance to change direction from within was crushed, the path ahead narrowed to one of escalating violence and coercion. From here, the war entered its darkest phase yet, not because the enemy outside was stronger, but because the machinery within had turned to terrorizing its own. Orders no longer needed to be rational, they just had to show resolve. Retreat became betrayal, surrender became a crime. Survival was placed below the image of loyalty. The failure of the July 20 plot revealed a bitter paradox. Those who acted to end the war were branded traitors, while the orders that continued to send the army to its death were upheld as the highest form of patriotism. Conscience, already fragile after years of drawn-out war, was now not just cast aside. It was treated as a threat that had to be eradicated. In that climate, many officers realized they had passed the point of no return. There was no longer any way to correct course through individual action. No hope that reason would ever return to the command table. From now on, the war would be governed more by fear than by strategy, and the army, once a fighting force, would slowly be reshaped into a tool of coercion, where orders existed not to achieve military objectives, but to maintain power and punish disobedience. The July 20th plot failed not simply because the bomb didn't kill Hitler. It failed because it couldn't break a system already willing to sacrifice everything, even itself, to avoid admitting it was wrong. From that moment on, the war was no longer sustained by belief or hope, but by fear and repression. And that marked the beginning of its darkest chapter, where irrational commands became law, and the German army entered a phase of survival under the terror of the very regime it once served. After July 20th, the war didn't just change direction, it changed in nature. The German army entered a phase where orders were no longer aimed at achieving military objectives, but at controlling people. The failure of the assassination plot shattered any remaining illusion that reason still had a place in the command structure. From that point on, fear became the regime's official instrument of control. Not fear of the enemy outside, but fear of the very system they served. The orders issued in the aftermath took on a new tone. No more explanations, no justifications, no room for doubt. Hold to the last man. No retreat under any circumstances. Surrender is treason. The language of war was stripped of tactical nuance, replaced by rigid slogans that read more like sentences than strategies. In this environment, military decisions were no longer judged by their effectiveness, but by how well they demonstrated absolute loyalty. For the soldiers and officers on the front lines, this created a cruel paradox. Once, danger came from the enemy. Now it came from behind as well. A reasonable retreat might save a unit, but could also get its commander executed for cowardice. An honest report might clarify the situation, but could also be used as evidence of undermining morale. In this world, telling the truth became a riskier act than fighting. The result was a deep distortion of the command structure. Reports no longer reflected the battlefield, they reflected what the recipient wanted to hear. Defeats were couched in neutral language, disasters were cloaked in the rhetoric of sacrifice, and when truth no longer circulated, every decision that followed was made on a foundation of delusion. The war machine, already incapable of adapting, now blindfolded itself. Within the army, suspicion spread like wildfire. No one knew who was a true loyalist and who might be doubted next. Offhand remarks, exhausted complaints, even silence could be interpreted as disloyalty. Internal surveillance groups gained power, embedding themselves in every unit. The army, once bound by shared objectives, was now fractured by mutual fear. The soldier no longer fought for victory, nor necessarily for ideology. He fought to survive within a structure where both advancing and retreating could mean death. At the front, he faced enemy fire. At his back, he faced the threat of punishment for disobedience. War became a corridor with no exit. Fortress orders became increasingly common. Every city, every strategic position was declared to be held to the last, no matter the cost. On paper, it looked like resilience. In practice, it was a systematic sacrifice of forces. Surrounded units were forbidden to retreat or surrender, even when defeat was certain. They were no longer strategic tools, but symbols deployed to preserve the regime's image of unbreakable will. It was here that spiritual collapse outpaced any enemy assault. When soldiers realized their deaths no longer served military purposes, but only an abstract political message, the last shred of faith fell away. Not faith in victory, that had died long ago, but in the value of their own sacrifice. And once that faith was gone, fighting became an empty reflex. In this context, a quiet but decisive shift began. German soldiers, especially on the Eastern Front, no longer asked how to win. They began to ask how to survive. When orders turned irrational, when the system behind them no longer protected but only punished, survival instincts began to replace any notion of honor or loyalty. This shift didn't appear in official documents or directives. It showed up in behavior, in delayed movements, in misunderstood commands, in choosing withdrawal routes that were less dangerous even if unauthorized. And most importantly, it showed in how soldiers began to redefine their enemy. For many, the greater threat was no longer the opposing force, but the possibility of falling into the hands of their own. As the Eastern Front continued to collapse, word spread about how Soviet forces treated prisoners. That fear was real. But alongside it, another fear grew, being captured by their own army's punitive units where death was nearly guaranteed. Between two fears, soldiers began to calculate, not through ideology, but through survival odds. From there, a new direction took shape within the collective mindset. It was never spoken aloud, never written down, but it was understood. If I must surrender, where should I do it? If I must retreat, which way should I go? The answer became increasingly clear: west. Not because they believed in a Western victory, but because they believed survival was more likely there. When an army is ruled by terror, loyalty ceases to be a virtue. It becomes a fragile mask hiding personal decisions. And the tighter the system clamps down, the more those decisions are driven by instinct. War, at this point, was no longer a clash of nations. It became a quiet exodus of millions trying to escape a machine that had spun beyond control. Irrational orders cannot hold an army together. They can only hold it in place, frozen by fear, until that fear is no longer enough to override the instinct to survive. And when that moment comes, collapse doesn't happen in a day. It happens in thousands of small, individual decisions, all pointing in the same direction. And so, from an army that once advanced with unwavering belief, the German force entered the final stage of the war with a single, silent objective: escape the storm from the east and find a path toward the west. Not to win, not to turn the tide, but to choose where they would fall, or, if they were lucky, where they might survive after it was all over. The westward retreat was never issued as an order, never recorded in any operational plan, and never officially acknowledged. But it existed, more clearly than any strategy in the final stage of the war. It spread like a collective instinct. Quiet, but consistent, threading through every unit, every group of soldiers, every glance exchanged along the muddy, shattered roads of retreat. When belief had died and orders had become tools of punishment, soldiers no longer chose how to fight, but where to end their own war. On the Eastern Front, the disintegration happened piece by piece, not through chaotic mass desertions, but through increasingly drawn-out organized withdrawals. Units were ordered to hold their ground to the last, yet in reality they moved slowly backward, night by night, stretch by stretch. Operational maps no longer reflected reality. Unit boundaries faded. Soldiers no longer held to strategic objectives, but to the small group beside them, those who shared the hunger, the exhaustion, and the fear. At this point, war was no longer a clash of clearly defined armies. It took place inside the mind of each soldier. Ahead was an unstoppable enemy. Behind was a system ready to punish anyone who dared acknowledge reality. And in between was the human being, exhausted, disoriented, and forced to make survival decisions in a world where moral standards had collapsed. Every westward step was more than a military maneuver. It was a choice between life and death. The retreating roads turned into endless rivers of people. Not just soldiers, but civilians, the wounded, logistics units, all blending together. The old structure collapsed. Rank no longer guaranteed safety. A man might give orders in the morning and by afternoon be just another person searching for shelter from the cold for himself and those around him. In that mass of people, no one said it out loud, but everyone understood. The farther west you went, the greater your chance of survival. Rumors traveled faster than any order. Stories of units crushed in the east, stories of prisoners' fates, stories of how the Western Allies treated those who surrendered. Not all of it was accurate, but it was enough to shape behavior. Soldiers no longer calculated based on honor, but probability. It was no longer a question of right or wrong, but of who might still be alive when it was all over. In that process, combat became situational, no longer a duty, but a reflex. When they had to fight to clear a path, they fought. When they could avoid it, they did. When they had to surrender, they weighed the time and place. No one dreamed of victory anymore. War had become a string of actions meant only to prolong life, by a day, an hour, even a minute. The bitter irony was this: the army once built on rigid discipline now survived on individual flexibility. What had once been seen as weakness, hesitation, evasion, even disobedience had become tools for survival. And what had once been glorified, absolute obedience, holding the line at all costs, now meant pointless death. The entire value system had flipped upside down, but no one had time to analyze that. They simply kept moving. In the final stretches of the retreat, the concept of a unit had all but vanished. There were only groups of people, sometimes thrown together by pure chance, moving in the same direction. Not out of trust, but because traveling alone was even more dangerous. In rare moments of quiet, the question was no longer when will the war end, but will I live to see that day? The flight to the west was not cowardice. It was not a betrayal of ideals. It was the direct result of a system that had destroyed its own moral foundation. When the state no longer protected the soldier, when orders no longer aligned with rational objectives, when faith had been replaced by terror, people were forced to fall back on their most primitive instinct, avoid death. By this point, the war had already been lost for a long time. But it kept going, like a lingering shadow grinding down everyone trapped inside it. The flight west was not a path to freedom. It was a path to an end to fighting, an end to illusion, an end to a machine once thought invincible. And within that stream of people, through the mud, the melting snow, and sleepless nights, there was one truth that needed no words. The Reich no longer existed in the minds of those who had once fought for it. What remained was only the human being, bare, fragile, and trying to step out of a nightmare they once believed was history's destiny. When war ends on paper, it has often long since ended in the minds of those who held the guns. The fall of an empire does not arrive with the signing of a surrender document, nor with the moment the final flag is lowered. It collapses slowly and silently, long before that, at the point where belief can no longer sustain action. When a soldier keeps fighting without believing in the purpose of the war, then the army, though still standing in form, has already lost its soul. Looking back on the entire journey, the most frightening part was not military defeat itself, but the way a machine once powered by absolute belief slowly corroded from within. In the beginning, faith was strength. It gave people the will to endure, to push past limits, to accept sacrifice. But when that faith hardened into dogma, no longer tested by reality, it became a burden. And when dogma was upheld by fear, it destroyed the very capacity for self-correction necessary for survival. The German army lacked neither soldiers, nor weapons, nor personal courage. What it lacked, in the final stages, was a reason strong enough to convince people to continue dying. When war was no longer a path to the future, but only a drawn-out extension of death, even the harshest orders became empty echoes. Obedience, when divorced from meaning, became a mechanical act, fragile in the face of survival instinct. Some fought until the bitter end, not out of conviction, but because there was no other choice. Some chose to retreat, not out of cowardice, but because they understood that their death would change nothing. And a few, just a few, tried to stop the disaster from within, guided by their own conscience, even knowing how unlikely success was. Each choice reflected the same truth. Belief was no longer the glue binding the army to its original purpose. History often favors tales of battles, of clear victories and defeats. But the deeper story lies in the invisible moments, when a person realizes they are fighting for something that no longer exists. That is the most dangerous moment in any war, because from then on, everything continues only out of inertia. And inertia, when no longer driven by reason or belief, will drag an entire system into the abyss. When the machine no longer believes is not just the story of an army in World War II. It is a timeless warning. Any system, no matter how powerful, that loses its capacity for self-examination, that equates doubt with betrayal, that prioritizes image and doctrine over people, is severing its own lifeline. Collapse, in that case, may come slowly, but it is inevitable. War, in the end, does not finish when the guns fall silent. It ends when people stop believing that their sacrifice means something. And once that moment arrives, no order is strong enough to reverse it. An army may still exist in name, but in truth, it has already disintegrated from within, one soldier at a time, one small decision at a time, until there is nothing left to hold it together. If you've stayed with this story to the end, take a moment to ask yourself, at what point in any conflict does belief begin to die before the people do? And when it dies, is there any path left besides collapse? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because history is not just for remembering, but for dialogue and reflection. And if you'd like to continue exploring the human stories behind the front lines with History War, beyond the numbers and maps, where people are faced with life and death decisions, don't forget to subscribe. Every subscription is a way for these stories to keep being told, not to glorify war, but to better understand its cost.